Hello, welcome to round 3 of the Crazyhouse World Championship 2020. We have a match here between myself, Mugwort, and Chickencrossroad, who is one of the top seeds from the USA. We don't have much of a history on Lee Chess, as you're about to see. Only 7 games between us. Down the bottom, Chicken is leading 5-2, so we have a 10-game match of 3+2 Crazyhouse. We'll take white in the first game. This is a long overdue commentary. The match was played on Sunday 30th of August, Sydney time, Australia. And this is already a couple of weeks after, so I may have forgotten some of the finer details in the games, but we start out with the e4, a6 as expected. And I have seen in the past Chicken has played a more passive move, bishop e7, than what he does in this game, which is bishop b4. So prepared for bishop e7, but looked a little bit into bishop b4 before the match, and I spent quite a long time here remembering exactly what I was going to do. And the most obvious move would be to attack the knight via pawn at e5, but then I would assume he would play queen takes d5 and answer ef6 with queen g5, and the pawn is also very useful on a3. So it's a bit of a messy line with queen takes d5, not really what I want to get into. So I actually looked at a piece sack before the match, which involved very standard looking moves like knight f3, bishop d3, and even allowing pawn at e4. So it's quite surprising that this is any good for white. But the idea after pawn at e4 is just to castle kingside and let black choose which piece he wants to take. If he takes the bishop, just take the pawn back, so he takes d3. And then eventually the pawn is very useful on e5. You could throw in rook e1 check first, perhaps. So it's a very interesting opening, allowing black to win a piece via pawn at e4. And then just castling next move. And you win the piece back eventually via pawn at e5. So obviously Chicken must be looking into this, but decides no, it's more aggressive to go pawn at a3 and try and win some material that way. So I have not seen this position before at all. I have to decide, should I castle and check with the rook? Should I defend with pawn at d2? Should I throw in a queen check first? Queen e2 check? I think it turns out queen e2 check was the best move. But I instead in this game castle and check with the rook. It does allow black to defend via bishop e6. And then of course I have several pieces hanging. I'm hoping for tricks like bishop takes f6, and if queen takes, then knight takes d5. And then everything for both sides is hanging. It's a big mess. There are several ways to block the check after rook e1. Again, pawn at e4 is an option. And then I'll have to decide which piece to take first. Probably bishop takes f6. And if bishop e6 here, then pawn at f5 seems a little bit slow. So I'm looking at sacking the knight on e4, but I'd rather take on f6 first to remove one of the defenders. And then, of course, if queen takes f6, knight takes d5, gains a tempo on the queen. So I'm assuming he will play g takes f6. Got to be a little bit careful if I allow the rook to the g file. And I probably should be throwing in a knight check on g7 just to displace the king before he has time for rook g8. But no, this is interesting move promoting first. And bishop takes d8 does not come with a threat because the bishop on b4 defends e7. So then he would answer queen takes d1. So I lost track of the material. I assume black's ahead, but that doesn't matter. I'm going for the attack. So yeah, probably knight takes knight at g7 check again before I think about what to do. But even if king f8, knight h5, it's easy to stop pawn at g7, just rook g8. Or bishop at h6, for example. I missed a brilliant move here. I think it was here, bishop at h6. And there is a brilliant way to deflect the bishop. So, considering this brilliant move that I missed, perhaps a better move would have been simply rook g8 in this position. He doesn't want to take a piece via the e pawn, because it opens up the e file. But the move here is queen c1. Queen c1 is the move that I missed. Not an obvious move at all. Yeah, it's a little bit awkward to know what to do with the bishop after queen c1. So, my other options, considering I missed this, well, there's pieces hanging everywhere as usual in my games. Pawn at g7 is most direct, but it's a little bit unclear what to do with the bishop after bishop takes, knight takes, let's say rook at g6. But I don't, because I missed queen c1, I didn't see anything better. So black certainly has the advantage here. Material advantage, and also got to watch out for stuff like knight at h3 and or perhaps rook at h1 coming. But this game still has some excitement to go, even though black looks like certainly has the advantage at the moment. They're both getting very short on time. Under 20 seconds each. Main threat at the moment would be knight e6 check, followed by simply knight takes queen. So just moving the knight back out of the way. Moving it to f5. I'm hoping for bishop takes, because then the white bishop takes on f5, it covers the key square on h3 for a knight drop. And I'm hoping to have time to play pawn at g7. So bishop takes, and bishop takes c3. Can I ignore that and go pawn at g7? Well, I'm trying. And here's where he mouse slips with rook at g3, and I panic. I should have just taken the free rook, h takes g3, and then set up a mate with bishop at g7, but I let him sack the rook back. It's a terrible miss from, well, both of us. It's a slip from Chicken. And now the bishop in hand doesn't actually threaten anything, because I let him block this long distance check via rook at g3, pawn at g6. So still black has the advantage. There was a knight at f3 trick there, but losing the queen anyway, and I have nothing. Yeah, bishop and pawn are not the pieces I need. I really need a knight for h5, but it's not coming. And yeah, it's not enough. So yeah, and I'm really not sure what was happening if he did the intended move, which is rook at h1, but obviously I'm losing this position. No more checks. Yeah, so rook at h1, king takes h1, f takes g2. And it's a question of if he had enough pieces to keep the checks up. I'm really not sure. Okay, Chicken takes the first one, but there were some big misses from both sides. So we have an e4, e5 opening with an early d6. And this line is a bit unusual with trading on d4 and the knight at e5. The knight takes c4. C5 or pawn at c5 are possible as well for black. But this is a very little known theoretical line with bishop e7. First time I've ever played it, actually. I dare say it's only been played a couple of times. So he has to decide whether to develop the pieces on the board via knight c3 or whether to drop the knight on d5 or h5. That'd be the main options. And if knight at d5, I would probably just answer pawn at c6. there was somebody who had a similar position who answered pawn at c6 with knight at b5. But I think in that position there was not the option of bishop at a5 with check and defending c7. So knight c3, thinking about knight f6, but then I changed my mind. Yeah, because pawn at h6 is a bit annoying. It's good to cover this with bishop at h6. I think now is a good time for bishop at h6. Trade the bishops off, develop the knight, defend f7. If he goes for knight at h5, then could probably just castle, or bishop at e5 or bishop at f6 look okay as well. So he's gone for knight at d5. And looks easy to defend with pawn at c6. Because the voice recording is coming a couple of weeks after the match, I'm very likely to forget the exact moves and the exact ideas, but I'll do my best. Pawn at c6, knight at h5. I should defend this by putting a new bishop on the board. e5 looks like the most logical square, where he has to spend a move to attack it via something like pawn at f4. And then in Bughouse you would normally answer this via a move which attacks the knight on h5, because the new bishop on e5 will defend g7, and then the knight on h5 is the main attacker. So I'm looking at lines like bishop at e5, pawn at f4, bishop to g4, and trading knights that way. And then the new knight in hand could be used for e5 to drive away the white queen, or it could also be used for h4 to attack g2. And don't forget also threatening c takes d5 at the right time. And I don't mind if he takes on e7 and then queen takes e7 back. So I thought I was doing reasonably well with the black pieces here, in a fairly unknown opening after 12 moves. Because he has a knight hanging on d5, then I thought he would do something forcing. There are not many forcing moves here, so I'm assuming pawn at f4. Pawn at d4 will end up in a similar position. So take the knight first. And looking at bishop g4. And on knight takes c7 check, I'm looking at both king f8 and also sacking the queen, followed by castling. The main problem there, the bishop on e7 is hanging as well. So too many pieces hanging, so I'm leaning towards king f8 on knight takes c7 check. Of course, there's also the option for white to go d takes e5 first. But no, knight takes e7, king f8, d takes e5. And I see there's also the option to leave the knight on h5 for the moment and go d takes e5. Also having a quick look at rook c8. Decided on d takes e5 because it opens up the d file. There's a big threat to go pawn at d2 and check, and then promote. So I'm assuming he's going to cover this before he tries to grab the rook in the corner. And then I will respond with bishop takes h5. So now it's a matter of who can attack first, because knight takes rook comes with the threat of rook at c8, but no, he goes bishop takes h6 first. And with only one knight in hand, there's certainly no mating threats, even if I allow pawn at g7 check. There's also the other option of knight at e6 check, grabbing the queen. And I thought he might try this because it does slow down the counterattack via pawn at d2. Another option might have even been for white to castle to slow down black's counterattack. Alright, so pawn at d2 draws the king onto the d file, so this comes with check. And yeah, bishop at a5 seems reasonable to pick up the knight. Or should I be dropping on knights with tempo now that I can? It also covers any potential counterattack on f7, assuming he finds a way to quickly unpin the bishop on d5. And knight at c5 was also possible. So just dropping on all the knights with tempo, block the check. Does look good for black. So he's sacking the queen to pick up a knight. But still there's no obvious way for white to get in. The bishop covers f6. 2 seconds left. Might as well take the knight. And here we go. Leaving the rook on h8. It's going to be a time scramble. He's got one pawn, but he needs another one for mate. So saving the queen. Yeah, I can just come back to g8 first, and knight at f6. I'll take it and go to h8. Again, he really needs another pawn to do anything. So I decide to take that, and then realize he can't take it back because probably pawn at d2 was good. So just defending, plugging up the hole on g7, pawn at d2, and could throw in queen at c1 check now, but decide to take first on e5. So black king is very safe. I have ways to attack via h3 and also queen at c1 check. So now's a good time that there's no blockers and should be made on the back rank somehow. Just take on a1 and then rook at e1 check. Yeah, no way for white to get out of this now. So scoreline is 1-1. I'm not quite sure whether I had full control of that game, but it got a little bit scary at one point after pawn at g7, and then I think he was only one diagonal short. It could have been a possibility to sack the queen on e4 perhaps, but hard to calculate with only 10 seconds or so remaining at that point. And I'm deciding whether to accept the gambit here with d takes e6 or go back to bishop g5. I certainly didn't remember it very well in the first game. But yeah, I realized there was an option to throw in the queen e2 check, so that's what we're about to see here. E takes d5, bishop d3, pawn at a3, and queen e2 check. So again, very surprising if pawn at e4 that you can just castle your way out of any danger and then recapture the pawn. It's almost like black in that case would prefer a pawn over a piece for h3 after castles. So queen e2 check, not so easy to block this time. If bishop e6, I think bishop takes f6 is the right move. Just thinking about castling first, but no. Can't remember what I did here. Oh, I did castle first. So a takes b2. And bishop f6. And this time, at least the queen's not hanging. So if he takes on a1, I will grab the queen on d8. G takes again, opening up that square for the knight on G7. Thinking, is there anything better than knight at G7 check? Yeah, if I'm going to save the rook on A1, for example, rook AE1, I should really throw in the knight check first. Again, the main aim is to displace the king down to D7, and then I should think about rook AE1, saving the rook here. Because if I take the bishop like I did in the game, he's not actually compelled to take it back. He could answer that with b takes A1 equals queen. He's also not compelled to play e takes d5 here, so yeah, I'm not sure whether I've done these captures in the right order. I probably should just save the rook earlier with rook AE1 when I had the chance. So take the bishop, but I still have a little bit of work to do to get in via e6. I'm not so worried about queen takes f1 check. It's more moves like pawn at h3 and knight at f4 coming. I realize at some point, if I have to attack, then I may even have to sack the queen via queen takes e6 check. Yeah, a move like bishop at h3 would be good in both attack and defense. Although it can be blocked out via pawn at g4. Knight at f4 also defends. Really not sure whether I should be putting a bishop on a dark square like this or a light square, h3, because this doesn't really stop knight at f4 if he can do what he did in the game. I think he did pawn at h3 here. So now I'm got to look at rook at h1 check, followed by hg2 and hd2 and knight at f4. The immediate knight f4, the immediate h takes g2. There's a lot of ways for black to start a counterattack, and of course in all these sequences he can throw in queen takes f1 check any time. And it's only a pawn that I'm taking back. It's a fake queen on a1. So I'd like to build up slowly via a move such as pawn d5, but it's a little bit too slow. The counterattack is too strong. So very hard to say what's the most accurate move here. G takes h3, he would answer again knight at f4 with the bishop being pinned on g3. Decide to get rid of the queen. Not that the pawn is very useful, but at least he's not going to get two rooks in hand. So expecting knight at f4 and then looking at the best way to sack the queen. And of course h takes g2 is also possible, with the main threat being knight at f4 to follow. So it gives me a chance to take and allow rook takes g2. I wasn't so worried about rook takes g2. It's more pawn takes g2. So now sacking the queen, and bishop at h3 at least gives me a chance to take on g2 if I need to. It would be best to block out the g file somehow with checks, although he's just done that for me. This checking sequence needs to be deadly accurate. Because after bishop takes g2, g takes f3 comes with a lot of threats. So I have blocked out the g file. I've attacked his queen, but of course I still need to cover the threat of bishop takes g2, of queen at h1 rather, by bishop takes g2. I think pawn at d6, he could have just taken that, c takes d6. So yeah, this is gonna lead to mate if he does the right checking sequence. And I think the right move here was queen at g4, followed by bishop at h3. It doesn't really look like mate. If queen at g4, king f1. But I think from memory it is. It's understandable though, you wouldn't really go for this long distance check with queen at g4. Because then you follow up check. I mean, it actually looks like the king is safe on e1, but I think there was some. So it might have been bishop at c3 when the king is on e1, then knight at g2, something like this. Anyway, he has let me. Actually, no. I think this is still a mate if he put a bishop on g5 first. And it's very hard to see with a few seconds which piece you should drop first. I think bishop at g5 would have been mate, because now with the pawn on g5, of course I have this escape option of e3 and d2. So now I'm the one with the checks. He's run out of heavy pieces and it's a mate. So I was lucky to get away with that one, but yeah, it's really hard to see the forced mating sequences without using the analysis board. So scoreline is 2-1. It's just one of those games where both sides were forced to attack desperately because there was no other choice. Yeah, so the moment I grabbed the queen with knight takes d8, that's when he was committed to the sequence with rook at h1 check, which should have been good enough to mate, but yeah, very hard to see the mate in 7 or mate in 8 or whatever it was. So game 4, a slight variation with an early pawn h3. So knight at g5, I don't mind this because knight to h6 is possible, but knight at e6 I think is the sharpest response. Because I actually want a knight in hand for f3, and I'm trying to do this. While neutralizing his threats at the same time on f7. And if he takes with the bishop, then I go bishop takes, knight takes, and I can insert the move h takes g2, and only then take back with the f-pawn. Because there are still not enough pieces to launch an attack via the hole on f7, and obviously then knight at f3 check is a massive threat. So taking with a knight, it means I can still insert the move h takes g2 and grab the knight back on the next move. So this opening is already looking very good for black. No reason why not to take with the bishop. And assuming he's just going to plug up the gap on f3 with pawn at e2, I can go ahead and trade the bishop, stick the knight on e5 with tempo. So, I mean, I'm only a pawn ahead. It's possible the pawn on g2 will drop. But he's going to have to sack the queen if he wants to build any sort of an attack quickly. Otherwise, even just normal developing moves, knight f6 next, and black has no problems at all. So because he's taking his time, I mean, I'm assuming he's looking at sacking the queen somehow like this. Because otherwise he'd just move the queen, queen c3, queen b3, something. This is really nothing to worry about, because now I still have a threat of queen at h1 and also bishop at h3. So I'm assuming he's going to stop bishop at h3 via... Yeah, there we go, bishop at h3. And the main options here are to allow him to capture the pawn on g2 and defend with something like knight e5 or bishop at d7. Knight f6 also perfectly reasonable. Or to attack and to sack the queen back via queen takes d7, king takes d7. Of course he needs a diagonal piece for e6 to attack. But he can go queen at h3 and queen takes g2. And I'm considering what I should be blocking with, and perhaps a little bit unclear, but perhaps a pawn is safer. And if I block with the bishop, it's likely to be attacked via a future pawn at f5. So I'm talking about the move queen at h3 and then something goes to e6 to block. It's possible even not to block with anything and just go king e8. And then a future bishop at d7 to cover the light squares. So it's very hard to see the best move from here. I completely missed the idea in the game because I was too concerned about counter-attack on the light squares via pawn at f5, pawn at d5 for instance. Queen at h1 check, I really shouldn't bother looking into this because it only helps him defend via queen at g1. So this move bishop at h3 does attempt to cover the light squares. But it's likely I'm going to have to sack a bishop and just leave it there on e6. But the best move would have been pawn at f3, very surprising. And if e takes f3, incredible move, bishop at f1 with threats on e2, and if king takes f1, queen at d1, checkmates, because I still have a pawn for e2. So yeah, very hard to see a pawn at f3 and bishop at f1. But I've messed this up completely. Probably the second best move would have been knight e5, because then it allows an escape square on f7 with the bishop, and he doesn't have a second diagonal piece in hand. So also useful moves instead of queen at h1, which is total garbage, would have been just to bring the king back, a move like king d8 or king e8. Knight f6 certainly can't hurt, but yeah, this is really a waste of a move, queen at h1. No need to play this at all. Because it looks like I'm going to have to bring the bishop back to e6. So now I'm going to have to sack a lot of material. So take, bishop takes. This move is also rather annoying because I can't play pawn at f7. That knight is just in the way. Yeah, I don't know, maybe knight d8. And even that, I was still under pressure. It's not like black is doing terribly badly here, but I've just allowed white back into the game for no reason at all. And I'm going to have to give up the knight on f7 after the following sequence. Bishop at e6 check. Bishop takes, pawn takes, king d8, e takes f7. And then I'll need to drop some pieces on to cover the light squares again. Perhaps knight at d4 was the best. Yeah, so probably knight at d4 here after the bishop trade. Knight at c5, yeah, it's okay in defense for the moment, but just allows him to trade, check on e6. One of the moves I completely missed was the next one, knight at b6 check. Very hard to deal with. So king b8, is it possible? Maybe king b8, but I think white has taken over the advantage now. There's going to be a rook at g8 coming. I think I have to take with the rook. And if I take back with the knight, well, either rook at e8 or queen at e8 look very powerful. Yeah, lost on time, but I think White's king was already super safe. And he's going to win a lot of material back very soon. So 2 games all. It was a good opening, but I messed up. In defense. Could have, even if I missed the most forcing line, which is pawn at f3, bishop at f1. I just play a normal move like knight e5, clear the square f7 for the bishop, bring the king back, try and starve him of diagonal pieces. But no, I really messed up. I had to give up a couple of pieces, which was unnecessary. Right, so this new opening from Chicken with queen e6 check. Queen e2 blocking. I'm looking for the right time to exchange queens, lure the bishop out from c8 and then go pawn at a6. Now, this is really not the right time. And I should just be playing knight f3 here and defending the pawn on d4. And then if he attacks it via pawn at g4, maybe knight g5 in that case, but then I still have problems with the d4 pawn. Perhaps knight f3 is not the right move at all. Probably bishop b5 in this case. Yes, so pawn at a6, even though it looks good, it's actually a mistake due to knight takes d4. And the line we're going to see in the game, it turns out to be good for black. Now, even though I've got queen at a4 check, queen at d7, I can steal that pawn on b7 with the tempo. Well, black will just play rook d8, as he does in the game. There's probably nothing better than trading queens. The bishop takes back. And then I have to cover c2 because there's nothing better. So we're going to see this in the game. I really don't have any improvements here. Queen takes, bishop takes. And already black has solved all the opening problems. Mainly because he can play e5 next after bishop takes d7. I don't like bishop d3 to defend because of pawn at c4. Just deflecting the bishop, and black will get the first attack. There's no real threat of a counter attack too via bishop takes f7 because I haven't played knight f3 yet. So queen at d1, he should just answer with e5. But yeah, one move can make all the difference. So bishop f5 is a mistake. And I think it was even more accurate to play bishop b5 check first. Or was it queen takes d4, deflecting the rook from the back rank? Yeah, it might have been queen takes d4. Anyway, this is still a good move, bishop pawn at d7, because it well, forces an interference. So if knight or bishop or king takes, there's obviously queen takes d4. And of course it's understandable why he didn't do that, but the move in the game, rook takes d7, is in fact even worse, because it allows promotion, and then black has to block with the queen, and it's just trading a real queen for a fake one. So yeah, might as well do that. And then there's some options here, like bishop b5 check. So bishop b5 check, try to uncover the d file so I can sack the queen and drop it back on b8 and perhaps pick up the knight on b5. And again, even queen takes d4 looks good for white, with a similar idea to what happened in the game, so I'm not going to reveal it yet, but you'll see very soon. And so at first sight, it looks like black is the one attacking with threats of knight takes c2, but yeah, this again is this interference theme, because if he blocks on d7, of course, this queen takes d4. If he blocks on c6, then yeah, you're about to see this. There's many interference themes. So now sack the queen on d4, and before I check on the back row, I want to include this move: bishop takes c6 check. And the main reason is to cut out all the defensive pieces blocking squares on the 8th rank. So it turns queen at b8 into a winning sequence of checks he has to block. I trade queens, and knight at b7 is going to be mate. So I think that's already game over. It's about mate in 4 or something from here. Yeah, and knight at b7 to finish. Alright, 3 games to 2, 5 to go. So the game may have looked fairly smooth from beginning to end, but yeah, somewhere in the middle. With this move e5 would have caused me a lot of problems, because I had no attack at that stage whatsoever. The knight was very secure, the bishop on f8 was open, the other bishop could then come back to f5. So I really should not repeat that same sequence again. So in the opening, knight f3 before d4 is a little bit more accurate. And then I can trade queens on pawn at a6 without just dropping the pawn on d4 for free. And knight f3 covers anyway. So I have a bit of a theme here with both colors, that I'm putting a pawn on early to disrupt the opponent and open up some squares to disturb the opponent in the opening. So Chicken now sacrificing a bishop on f7, knight at g5 check. And I don't mind sacking the queen, because I know that he needs a knight to mate me on d8. If he doesn't have a knight, then I'm not so worried about a queen check on c4 or d5, because I just block with the bishop. If queen c7, I can play bishop e7 or bishop cd7. He's going to run out of checks soon. So I'm anticipating that eventually he'll play queen at f3 check, pick up the pawn on g2. But I still have 2 knights on the board. So I want to keep these knights to harass the queen when he takes back on g2. And if I block the check with bishop e7, it's likely that I'll be able to take on g5. So I'm looking at queen f3 check, pawn at f6, because I want to take on g5 after queen takes g2. And then think about whether to drop the knight in the end on h4 or f4. I think this has been played a couple of times, but I don't think anyone's played knight at h4, which I did in the game. In fact, knight at f4 is a little bit more accurate to cover some squares closer to the white king. Yeah, so this position I'm talking about, assuming white's going to drop a pawn on f5 or d5 and win the bishop back, but that's okay because the bishop is already defended, and I really need to focus on counter-attacking and harassing the queens quickly. So yeah, knight at f4 is a little bit more accurate, but it's still not too bad. Knight at h4. So assuming he takes, I take. And here, I'm really not sure how to proceed, because although I can play a move like bishop at f4 or bishop at e5, it's not so clear what the purpose of the bishop is. Assuming eventually I stick a knight on f3, he goes king d1. The bishop and knights are not combining very well together. Well, the bishop's useful in defense to defend the squares like d6. Yeah, if I play bishop at f4, then still not really clear what's happening. The other thing is I could take a pawn if it's useful for e2 or g2. I'm really not sure what the evaluation is at the moment. Perhaps the best is just to sack the queen on g2, and then knight takes g2, and to cover up squares like e2, and bishop at e2, for instance. Yeah, because of course he's got pawn at e6 check, but it's not going anywhere in the short term. Because he's taking a long time, I'm assuming he's looking into all sorts of queen sacks after pawn at e6 check, and perhaps queen takes f3 check, queen takes c8, knight at d7, and stuff like this. But I didn't see it going anywhere. I thought he had to either play rook e1 or queen takes g2 here, which I was okay with. Alright, so this is very forcing, but I still don't see a mate for white. And even though he can promote, king's very safe on d8, because the knight gets in the way on d7. I have enough blockers not to have to block any bishop check with the queen. I can now block with the bishop or a pawn. So I think queen at d3 check here was the fastest mate for black. But yeah, just deflecting the rook off the first rank, and either promote or queen at f1 must be good. I almost forgot that I had two queens in hand. Yeah, promote to knight, and if king f1, bishop at e2, queen at f1, and if king h1, knight hops out of the way. Okay, so 4-2, looking good. I'm going to improve on the move order, so this really should turn out even better than last game. Because now queen takes is very strong on pawn at a6. It's very hard for black to find a good defensive move here. Because if b takes, then queen at b7 wins a piece. That's mainly what the tactic is based on, not only softening up the light squares, but it is a piece for a pawn if b takes a6. So you could drop a queen on b6 or c8, for example. But certainly no counterattack like what happened in game number 5, 2 games ago. So queen at c8, looking at options of queen at b5 to threaten a takes b7. There's also just trading on b7 and then queen at b5 or queen at a6. I think queen at b5 is the most accurate. Because I'm still hoping to undermine the defense of the knight and hopefully just win a stack of material for free. I decide to trade first and then queen at b5. Still looks good. As the queen at the moment is unprotected. Not many moves here for black apart from rook b8. But no, queen takes b5, bishop takes b5, and lots of tempting moves here. Queen at b7, pawn at b7, bishop takes c6, and Well, this wins at least a pawn. Also looking at ideas of trading off the bishop on e6. So, for example, knight at g5 or knight at d4. Rook c8. I don't necessarily want to rush into queen takes c6 check, because then bishop at d7, queen comes back, or queen a6 or something, and then perhaps pawn at h3. And he'll do a similar trick on me if I take it. Queen at g2 is coming. So I think knight at d4 is probably the most accurate. And also knight at e5 is interesting, with the idea of pawn at d7 check and then knight takes d7. But yeah, I'd play knight at d4 if I had this position again. I think it's good. I was expecting some sort of a bishop drop to cover e6. And I certainly wasn't expecting the next move, which is bishop at h3. And really, this should not work at all. I think I should just take that bishop in 1 second as soon as I see it land on h3. Considering what happened in game 1 when I had 3 seconds left and chicken mouse looked with rook at g3, I should just take it in 1 second. But no, it was too generous in game 1. Yeah, I don't think just take it. The knight on f3 is defended. I mean, queen at g2 is not even a serious threat at all. Just play rook g1. So, looking at all kinds of moves. The queen takes c6 check, knight takes e6, but no, I should just take it. Pawn at g2, rook g1. There's still no threat, apart from, well, now queen at f1. So there are lots of moves here, like bishop at c4 is perfectly fine, bishop at a6. But the key move here is to go queen a6, so double purpose move, defending f1 threat and also attacking the rook on c8. So queen a6 is a very important move to gain time. And then rook d8 or something, I can drop a bishop on somewhere like e2. But queen c4, yeah, same idea, but it's not quite as effective. I suppose it turns out the same if he's going to play queen at f1. And queen a6, a little more forcing. Alright, so take. I've got a big time advantage. There's no need to go king takes f1. I think it allows a bit of counterplay, perhaps drop the bishop somewhere threatening, or maybe a move like pawn at e6. I've got to do something to counterattack. Yeah, so pawn at e6 would have been the way in. Pawn at c6 now, perhaps. Queen at g1, bishop at queen at h1, bishop at g1. Drop the rook, take. And now no easy way. I've got to defend with the queen. It's starting to get a bit scary. You can take that a couple of times, stick the queen back on h1. I still didn't think he had enough to mate, but I may have to shed another piece on g1. Bishop at h3, king e2. Rook at e1 should survive, at least in the short term, king d1. So any bishop drop, I can put a pawn on f3. So still surviving. Queen takes h2, king d1. Now lots of pieces defending f3. Got a discovered check possible. Pawn at g4. It's just a matter of surviving here. Defending the check. Queen takes f2 perhaps coming. I probably should just go rook takes e4 with check. Don't know whether there's any serious threat. Got to watch things like queen f1 check and knight at f2. But yeah, there's just a move with 1 second left. He should have just taken it. Queen takes g3. Just completely random moves at this stage. Now, if I can put some pieces on, I'm not doing too bad. Perhaps bishop at f2 instead of queen at e2. Well, this is okay. Actually, no, the queen at e2 is better. It covers the knight as well on f3. But I need to start counterattacking. I've still nothing going on for me. Pawn at c6, for example, now. I'm too concerned about queen sacks. Yeah, this attack is going nowhere. I was trying to stop castling with this move. Perhaps I should have just gone knight takes c7 after all. But yeah, now no need to sack on d5 because this attack is getting nowhere and I've completely forgotten about the counterattack on e2. So this is a very bad time scramble for me. And now I'm just dead lost. So plenty of chances in that game. Yeah, not so good defense. And when his attack started with rook at f1, or was it queen at f1 check, I had plenty of time left at that stage, like 30 or 40 seconds. The attack was not so serious at that stage, and I think at one moment I could have counterattacked via pawn at e6. It would have been dangerous. I just missed that 1 or 2 chances. And yeah, I'm more of a counter-attacking player rather than just put pieces around the king and defend everything, so I sort of tried to do both at once, but it was not very successful. But yeah, that was a bit unfortunate to lose that game after such a good opening. It could have been 5-2. But now we're back to 4-3. Chicken switched up the openings to d4. So I think when black plays an early bishop d6, I think he's generally doing okay. So I think taking on e5 is correct. The option I was looking at is knight g to e7. But yeah, you got to be careful here not to be overrun on the dark squares. So I think take again and then bishop at c4. My first move that came into my head was pawn to f6. I guess this is not so bad. I think taking is okay as long as I follow it up actively with a move like bishop at c4. Bishop at d3, take. Maybe even look into moves like knight at c1 after that. Sack on d3, put a pawn on h3. I've got to do something to pressure him, otherwise white's always going to have a little bit better central control. The queen on e2 is well placed unless I start to harass it early. And if ever I develop the knight on g8, there's problems on the dark squares with knight at h5 and bishop at f6, for example. So it's already a critical position where I can't afford to waste a move. And if I drop something on the king side, he's going to switch his attention to the queen side, like bishop at a4 check. Yeah, perhaps bishop at c6 was a little bit safer to cover the queen side. I didn't sense the danger, though, on the queen side. I thought, oh yeah, trade bishops, I'll be okay. Because I see if knight at c5, there's a bishop at b4 check. I was very reluctant to play the move c7, c6. after bishop at b5, for example. Yeah, because I'm looking at knight at d6 check, king f8, knight takes b7. I might just collapse everything on the queen side. Perhaps there is a queen b6 after that. I couldn't quite work it out. At first sight, this looks okay for black. There's no obvious way in on the king side. It looks like, well, if he repeats, I'll just take a draw, bishop at a4, and bishop takes. Or he could even take back with the queen and then find a way to sack the queen. For example, bishop at c6, queen takes, and bishop takes c6. So this move covers the square c6, so I really don't want to take on b5. I'm looking for a good knight drop, but I don't quite see one. Again, maybe c7, c6 here, and just try and push the bishop back and accept a passive position is probably the best I could do. I'm just too uncertain here. I just end up burning a minute on the clock for no reason, instead of just making a move. So knight at c6, I think he's happy to trade. And I was expecting a move like bishop at b7. Well, I have knight at a5 covered by bishop at b4. Bishop at a4 also possible, because then if I spend the bishop on b7, then he has knight at a5. So yeah, I see a lot of good moves for white, but I don't see any counterattack from my side. I think already white has an overwhelming positional advantage. He's just waiting till I go knight e7, and then he's gonna attack on the dark squares instead. So bishop e4, just a desperate attempt to counterattack. Because I'd really like to pick up a knight and then go bishop takes g2 and knight at f3 check. But yeah, pawn f3. What else? I mean, I had to bring the bishop back, but I'm just going to lose material in any case. Yeah, I don't really have an answer to this move. I mean, I probably should just take it and wait for the right time to sack some material back. I just thought I was already lost. So sack the queen for some relative king safety, but the problem is the dark squares. Pawn at f6. I still have bishop at h4 check, but he finds a good way to do this, blocking with the queen on f2. So bishop at h4 check, queen at f2. And if I take the queen, queen takes f2, there's no way to cover all the holes on g7, f6, so it looks like I'm going to have to sack the bishop for a pawn, even though he's offered a queen. Alright, but it's pretty much over. White has a winning position. It's going to be 4-all very soon. Still surviving. I mean, perhaps I could pull off an upset against a swindle against a lesser player, but certainly not Chicken. He's just going to keep the material advantage and make sure that fake queen gets some use by trading off pieces on the back rank. it's just too much. I'm putting up a valiant effort in defense, but there's no way. No way White will ever lose this with such a safe king. Yeah, this time no way to defend. So finally, 4 games all. And we'll see if we get another Scandinavian. Alright, different opening again. E4, knight f6, knight c3. Knight c6, d4. e6. Alright, this opening is as old as the hills in Crazyhouse, Bughouse. So in Bughouse you can also castle and sack the pawn on c3, or bishop d2 is possible as well. You often see a sack on f2 and knight takes d4, queen h4, check, that sort of stuff. So here knight takes c3, bishop g5 is immediate response. And white is okay with the queen trade because the king is a little bit safer. Generally trying to lure the black king to take the bishop on d8 and then try and stick a diagonal piece on d6 and keep harassing the weaknesses on c7 and e7. And sometimes looking for a move like queen at g5 check and picking up the pawn on g7. Queen takes g5 is also possible, but white also has resources against this with knight takes d1 and queen at h5. And it's also possible to avoid the queen trade, like this pawn at e7, queen e1, so black will stay a pawn ahead. But white is just building up an attack, waiting for black to castle. So this is a little bit of an obscure move. One of the reasons why this move is played, bishop at h5, is to cover the f3 square in case you want to take on e4 twice and then there's a bishop at d5 in response. So then your queen is not tied backwards to the knight on f3 and you don't end up losing the pawn on d4. So there are means to keep defending the pawn on d4. I mean, you can start slowly here with pawn c3. There's nothing wrong with pawn c3, or even bringing the bishop on g5 back to d2 or e3. Nothing wrong with this. But I'm going to take the most aggressive approach and sack on e7 and then just try and blast through on the dark squares, take on e4, pawn at f6, this sort of thing. Yeah, so if anything takes on f3, I always have that option to bring the bishop back and take on f3, so I don't get busted open immediately with f takes g2, stuff like that. So still deciding on the move order, which piece I should take first, whether to go bishop takes e4, queen takes e4. But the point of invasion is usually on the dark squares, even though pawn at e7 is an attempt to bolster the defense on the dark squares. I've got to crash through. So yeah, again, of course it's possible to play more slowly with moves like c3. But not so much my style. I try and keep the games as short as possible. So take, pawn at f6, g takes, e takes, queen takes, and pawn at g5, fairly forcing. So then Chicken has the choice which way to move his queen, back to g7 or back to d8, trying to avoid any future trades harassing the queen. For example, a bishop would be very useful for f6, but it's not going to come just yet. I'm still relying on black to put some of those pieces on the board so I can trade them. certainly no mate at this stage for white. And again, that bishop on h5 looks like a strange piece, but it does have some purpose in covering backwards. So I want to pick up the pawn on e4, and then I'll just see where the queen is, and perhaps try and trap the queen in the corner on h8 if it goes back towards that way via g7, or yeah, if it goes back to d8, then I probably should drop the knight on check first on h6 and then go queen takes e4, because if he covers the dark squares via pawn at g7, then I can go knight takes f7 and pick up the rook. And then I'm still attacking in different directions and threatening a possible queen sack on h7. So I probably should drop the knight on first on h6, so there's more attacking options. Whereas what happened in the game is I took the pawn back immediately on e4. So it does give him the option here of putting a pawn on g7, and I don't have that knight check. But still looks good with pawn at f6 coming after pawn at g7. So I still think the piece sack is worthwhile here for white. Even though black is a whole bishop ahead, it's very difficult to defend in this sort of position. Only 5 seconds left, bishop at f5. I think taking is good on g7. It's the sort of thing I should do immediately and not think too much, because there's a lot of pawn drops and captures and checks possible here. But there's absolutely no reason why I shouldn't just take the rook on f8 and then go knight at f6 check, assuming the queen is going to take. So g takes f8 check. If queen takes knight at f6 check, king h8, and rook back on e8, it's just completely winning. But I completely messed this up. Did the wrong move order. Really wasn't what I was intending. I could have just taken an extra rook for free, but no. I realize I don't have enough pieces. The knight is on the wrong square to mate. This move is very timely. Pawn at h3 and counterattack, because it does come with an immediate threat of knight at e2 check. So now I have to defend, because bishop at f6 check, he just goes king g8. Yeah, I'm not getting mated, but it's still a big problem of not having the right pieces to attack with, even if pawn at g7, rook e8. So the knight on e4 stops the smothered mate guarding f2. But I'm not threatening anything. And I think the only move to survive here was bishop g4 and get rid of the knight quickly. And this is a very slow attempt to defend by pawn at g2 and bishop f3. But now the problem is, because he's getting rid of the knight on e4, I can't even take it back without getting smother mated with queen at g1, knight at f2. So I'm just losing too much material. And still got no attack. Ah, what a shame. Yeah, just g takes f8 equals queen, and should have been an easy win after that. Nah, completely messed up. Yet again. There's no way Chicken's going to lose this, so I resign. It's going to be 4 games to 5, 1 game to play. And back to d4. Another one of these d4, d5, knight c6, bishop g4. So we're going to see a similar opening again, but this time a slight difference with the way he captures on e5. Bishop e2, queen e2, bishop e5. And I think this time he took with the pawn d takes e5. So I'm rushing into this knight at g6, just because it makes a direct threat on e5, but again, it's worthwhile to put the bishop on c4 and trade bishops, and then use that knight to attack something. It's too easy to pin the knight here, and then the bishop ends up passive on d7. And again, similar theme, he's waiting for the knight on g8 to move, so he can play something like bishop at f6. And then, whether I castle or not, I'm going to have problems with the king's safety. Yeah, I don't know what to do here. Perhaps d4 and put the bishop on d5. I don't know, this pin is a lot more annoying than it looks at first sight. Of course, there's no compulsion for white to take. Bishop at g5. So it's given me some options because I didn't really look too much in the game at moving the queen c8, for example. But it did mean that h6 is a serious threat. It just wins a piece. So I'm doing my usual style and trying to complicate things as much as possible when in trouble. But yeah, moving the queen was okay. I mean, this is not so bad. Expecting knight at h5 and then looking into bishop takes bishop, knight g7, king f8. It's all fairly forcing. And then knight comes back, the bishop comes back to h6 to stop pawn at g7. Yeah, not expecting him to take here because queen takes and threatens queen b4 check, and queen is quite well placed on e7. So yeah, this is not giving me a lot of options. I don't want to play king f8 here. It's just knight takes g7 and pawn at f6 is going to be very annoying. So take on g5. And bishop comes back. So pawn at g5, what are the options? Sack the bishop on g5 or bishop g7, knight takes, king takes. It's very suspicious. And more survival chances, at least it gives the king more room if I sack the bishop on g5. And there are some possible threats of queen takes g2 and also queen c1 at the right time. So if bishop at g7, there's also the option to sack the queen on g7. Take the knight, he's only got a queen in hand. He can pick up a knight on c6. And then, well, I have to decide, can I take it back with knight at h5 coming? I'll lose some material back. So I decided to just abandon the rook. And I should be playing the move queen takes g2 here immediately. So obviously queen c1 not so good with rook at d1, but also looking into the idea of knight d4, trading bishops, because I thought that gives the king a bit more room. But queen takes g2 was actually good, because then if rook at g1, queen takes h1, rook takes h1, and rook at c1. So in that case, he only has a queen to block with on d1. And if king d2, I can just pick up the rook. And surprisingly, there's no mate with knight g7, just king f8. Or king d8 even. So this is a critical position where I have to include the move bishop at b4 check. And then I'm actually doing okay after queen takes g2 next. But no, I can't take g2 and allow when bishop takes d7 check. I was looking more at rook at e7 check, but I just completely I forgot about bishop takes d7 first, and then he's got moves like knight at c5 coming. It's going to be too much, too hard to defend. And Chicken is going to take his time here and try to find, or try to calculate all the way to the end, if he can do it all with checks. Yeah, but it still would have been an interesting game after bishop at b4 check, just covering e7 and f8. And then queen takes g2. Because I still have a knight in hand. If rook at g1, there's knight at f3 check. I don't have to sack the queen in that case. And bishop at b4 even helps cover the square c5 in case knight at c5 is dangerous. Yeah, it would have been interesting to see how the game would have continued after bishop at b4 check first. He's trying to find the most precise checking sequence, starting with bishop takes d7 is the best. King takes bishop at a4 check. I think knight at c6 strangely was the last chance to survive. And this is already too hard because he's going to sack the bishop and the queen on b5, and then the two knights and the rook are enough to mate. Sack the bishop, sack the queen. Knight at d4 check stops the king coming back via c6 and d7. So knight d2 and knight at b3 covers all the squares. That's it. So this match has officially ended 6-4 in favour of Chicken Crossroad. This was round 3 of the Crazyhouse World Championship, recorded a couple of weeks after the match was played. I had another match against Jasugi99 last week, who's the favourite and the top seed. And I'll post that at some stage in the next week or so. But yeah, some exciting games, missed chances from both sides. A funny mouse slip which wasn't taken advantage of in game 1. And lots of time scrambles, but not many of them went in my favour. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more matches coming very soon.